Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. We're going to get started here. So we have a lot of amazing panelists today from across the United States. So I'm going to start with a quick presentation, about 10 minutes to set the stage for our amazing panelists. Then we will bring them on stage and they'll quickly introduce themselves, and then we'll get into some questions with them. But I want to kind of set the stage of why we're here, why entrepreneurship policy is so important, and what's happening here in the United States. So today we're going to talk about emerging models to foster entrepreneurship through policy. This is me. I'm Jason Groh. I'm the Chief Government Affairs Officer at Right to Start, a nonprofit civic organization working to reduce barriers for entrepreneurs and increase entrepreneurial opportunity for all throughout the U.S. I'm a former Missouri State Representative, an entrepreneur who has been a consultant and exited one of my businesses as well. So I've worked in politics, law, media, as well as entrepreneurship with a product manufacturing company. So I got my slides and my thing. The why. Why are we here? Why is entrepreneurship policy so very important at this time? Well, that's because new businesses create almost all net new job growth. And I'll get to a poll we did later in this presentation, but only 18% of voters know about that, and that's a problem. So we're working to enhance that knowledge throughout the country. This graph shows the net new job creation by firm from 2000 to 2018. You can tell on the top that the blue line represents businesses under 5 years old. These are the businesses that are creating the most net new jobs. The red line are businesses 5 to 9 years old. They're pretty much stagnant and steady. And then the lower line is businesses over 10 years old. They usually shed jobs over time. This graphic was provided by the Kauffman Foundation. So what we know is that new companies equal new jobs. New businesses grow GDP, they increase lifetime incomes, they increase community wealth, they fight inequality and poverty, and they create homegrown jobs. These are things we need to share not only with policymakers, but with entrepreneurs and our neighbors, because we're trying to not only build knowledge with policymakers about the importance of entrepreneurship, but also the citizens of our communities need to know about it so they can rally behind entrepreneurship and why it's so important. As I mentioned at Right to Start, we did a national survey at the end of 2022 with the top pollster on the Republican side of the aisle, Whit Ayers, who's always quoted in Wall Street Journal. He's been a pollster for George W. Bush, for Ron DeSantis, and also with the top Democratic pollster in DC, Jeff Guerin, who's worked for Hillary Clinton, among others. And we asked the question about American entrepreneurship and if each person should have a fair opportunity to start and grow in their own business. 94% of all the respondents agreed across all political parties. But when we asked them, do they think it's hard right now in the US to start and grow your own business today? Also almost unanimously across party lines. 45%, very difficult, 47%, somewhat difficult. So that's a problem. They want people to have a chance, but they believe it's too hard. And when you break all those numbers down, that equals 15 plus million businesses that were not started because of, in part, the reasons on this screen. The people that responded to the poll stated these reasons. They were not given to them. These are the reasons why they didn't start their business. And as you can see on here, most of them are due to self-inflicted wounds through government. You know, insufficient capital and fear of failure are always in the top. But after that, you see things like couldn't afford government fees, confusing forms, healthcare issues, couldn't get right training or info, services were poor, too slow on approvals, and non-competes held them back. And as I stated, these are self-inflicted wounds, and policymakers throughout the country can change these things because new and small businesses are so important to our economy. And in the poll, when we asked people, would you be more likely to support a candidate who drove these messages forward, who talked about entrepreneurship, who talked about reducing barriers? Well, 60% of all parties said, Democrats, Republicans, and Independents said yes, we'd be more likely. So campaigns, politicians, government officials should be talking about this more because voters actually do care about it. So Right to Start, one of our pillars is changing policies. We work to change communities, change minds, and change policies. I run the Changing Policies department at Right to Start. In our poll, we asked people, do you favor entrepreneurship policies? We went through a host of issues. All of them are listed here on the screen. And the highest support was 91% across all party lines for our issues. And the lowest was 65%. So we're talking about ideas that resonate. At the low was 65% of Republicans, Democrats, and independents, and over 90% at the high. This stuff is not seen in polls very often. This is a united issue for policymakers, and we'll prove that out here in a second with what we're going to talk about bipartisanship. That poll is at righttostart.org/poll if you want to see it. There's a whole 10-page debrief on the poll. So we're active in state legislatures, we're active in cities, we're active in the federal level, not only through testifying in support of bills, but also meeting with policymakers and driving civic change. Some of the states we've been engaged in here on the screen. Right to Start Acts have been moving throughout the country, and we'll get into some of those here in the presentation later. Over 40 pieces of legislation in 15 states, and this does not include states that have done things through executive action or through their budget process. A typical Right to Start Act, the very low-lying fruit, or low-hanging fruit of what a state can do is establish an office of entrepreneurship. Should have one dedicated individual dedicated to nothing but young and new businesses in a state. And the things listed on the screen are things that we think are important for that one individual to do. I will note, we'll get into this with Senator Fitzwater later, the annual State of Entrepreneurship report is a huge thing because it gives legislators the ability to show the citizens of the state as well as the other policymakers how important entrepreneurship is. They can tell their story about what they've been doing, which hopefully will lead to more funding around entrepreneurship in the future for their offices. This was approved by the Council of State Governments in their shared state legislation. Now, I'm very excited to share that the state of Nevada, in fact, does all these things now. The first Right to Start Act was signed by the governor there, a Republican. The Speaker of the House, a Democrat, was the sponsor of the bill. And they're working now to issue their annual report in November around entrepreneurship. So this is very exciting, and this happened in 2023. Shortly after that, in New Mexico, the Right to Start Act, which focused on an Office of Entrepreneurship, passed the House and the Senate there, and the governor used an executive action to fund the office. Kansas, a state which is close to where I live in Missouri, now has a director of small business and entrepreneurship, due in part through all-day hearings that Right to Start pushed for on entrepreneurship in the state. They exacted a director of entrepreneurship through a budget issue in the Department of Commerce. So there was never a law passed there, but they did it anyway through their budget. And I'm happy to report, and we'll hear more about this later from Senator Fitzwater on our panel, that we have major movement in Missouri, and you'll see I was so excited I typed Missouri twice into the document at the top. This bill was just signed into law last week, actually, on Tuesday in Jefferson City. And this was the first ever Right to Start Act that was actually filed in 2021. And it changed throughout the years. We had to start over numerous times, but in 2024, it actually was accomplished. And Senator Fitzwater will get into all the details on this, but this was a huge deal for us in a state where only 28 bills that were not budget bills passed out of 2,700 that were filed in 2024. And Senator can get into kind of the issues there, but very bipartisan. And you can see in the legislation, it actually states, create an Office of Entrepreneurship. It has the Right to Start Act in the name, in the bill. So these are things that we're very excited about, that these things are actually being put into law. In other news, in Michigan, we met with their senior advisor to Governor Whitmer, and they just introduced their first ever Chief Innovation Ecosystem Officer. That person's going to be in charge of kind of doing the things that a Chief Entrepreneurship Officer would do in the state. We're also working with the Michigan Micro Business Coalition there to try to do more around micro businesses in the state. Victor Wong, our CEO and founder, was just there for the Mackinac Policy Institute event, and here he is giving one of our lucky coins to the new director of entrepreneurship in the state. And I'll close here with new leaders in Colorado and Utah. I just met with Laura Rodriguez on Friday, who's now the Director of Innovation and Ecosystems, who's already coordinating policy between government bodies on entrepreneurship and also tracking data, which is very important to the Office of Entrepreneurship there. So we're working with her. We hope to establish a network of these directors here in the not too distant future so they can lean on each other and provide resources to each other of the work they're doing in their state. Utah also named a director of entrepreneurship here in the last 3 months or so inside their governor's offices of economic opportunity. In addition to all these things Right to Start is doing, we also have a field guide for policymakers that's on our website, righttostart.org. Here you can find good ideas for state, local, and federal policymakers and things you can share with them when you're advocating on entrepreneurship in those states. I'm not going to go through these, but in addition to the Office of Entrepreneurship, tracking of government contracts for new businesses, and working to get 5% of government contracts, workforce development, and economic development spending going to new and young companies under 5 years old. We also support a lot of other advocacy endeavors and policy recommendations that are all up on our website as well in the Field Guide for Entrepreneurship. So we are having an impact. We're only 4.5 years old now, and we've had involvement in over, I think with our ambassador network, close to over 35 states now. But I really care about the policy change, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So I want to thank everyone for their time today, and just under 10 minutes, guys. So now I'm going to bring up, with the help of our folks, the incredible panel that we'll have today, and we'll introduce them, and we'll do a Q&A with them as well. So thank you for your time today, and we look forward to starting the panel presentation here now. Now it's time for the real fun. I'd like to introduce our panelists today from all over the United States. I'm going to start to my immediate left with David Watkins from Indiana. David, tell us about yourself, what you do, and what your title and role is here in Indiana.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. So David Watkins, I serve as the Senior Vice President of Entrepreneurship and Small Business at the Indiana Economic Development Corporation. So very similar to some of the offices and positions that have been created in states across the country. Part of my role is overseeing our Office of Small Business and Entrepreneurship, as well as a lot of the innovation investments that the state is making around our entrepreneurial ecosystem. So very excited to share more about that as we go and participate in this conversation.
And we will get into hosting GEC 2025 as well.
Oh, that's the best part.
Senator Fitzwater, State Senator from Missouri, Travis Fitzwater, tell us about yourself and what you do.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. I've always wanted to come to Puerto Rico. It's beautiful, so thanks to you as host. You've been very gracious. Great conversations already with some of your leaders at last night's reception, and today just so welcoming. And so I appreciate that. Honor to be here. I'm a state senator in the state of Missouri, and entrepreneurship is just a big deal to me. And so it's reflected in the policy that I've carried in these areas, and excited to talk about it today.
We're looking forward to that discussion. And finally, Tom Sullivan, a board member for GEC as well as from the U.S. Chamber. You're fighting day in and day out for policies that help entrepreneurs throughout the country on the federal level.
Well, that actually was my introduction.
I used to do a radio show, so this is time for you to...
So thank you.
Yeah.
It's great to be here. I'll do a special shout out to the Puerto Rico Chamber of Commerce. There isn't a place in the world, actually, that I go to where I'm not welcomed by either a local or state chamber of commerce. So it's a great opportunity to be here in Puerto Rico and contribute to this panel. Thank you.
Okay, let's start with Senator Fitzwater. I feel like you always have to go to the politician first, right? Although he is an entrepreneur as well. I'm going to call you Travis, if that's okay. We're friends now. Take us through the journey in Missouri. I remember at the beginning when I think you might have seen a tweet, or you followed some of the research Kauffman Foundation did, or you followed Victor Wong, and we got connected to you. And take us through the process of how we got to today and the journey, because I think it's really impactful, because Senator Fitzwater kept fighting and fighting in a legislature that was very hard. He started in the House with this bill and then was elected to the state Senate, which frankly was a huge moment for you to get into the Senate, because he had a very tough primary. So the bill probably would have been dead and gone if Travis wasn't elected to the state Senate. So tell us about kind of the journey of the Missouri Right to Start Act. Not only does that, it has the Office of Entrepreneurship, it has the regulatory sandbox as well.
I think part of it starts with story, and Victor is that story for me. I just followed, social media is for my generation, is such a big deal, and making connections there's so many ways you can leverage that as a young professional, and so I leveraged it to make connections with Victor after I heard his story and his work with the Kauffman Foundation. Shortly after meeting him, I think Right to Start was launched. And so we, just kicked around ideas. I thought, hey, Victor, come talk with me. I think the state does a poor job. Most states do a poor job of incentivizing the wrong thing, or they do a great job of incentivizing the wrong things. And in my opinion, we spend so much in the state of Missouri, I can only speak to us, but so much trying to attract businesses outside the boundaries of our state. All of our resources go to that, which is great. It has its value. It's a good thing. We spend so much less on entrepreneurship. The entrepreneurs, the people that are willing to take the risk in our state, the people we're probably more likely to keep in Missouri are the ones that take the risks. They start the businesses. They employ individuals. They're much more likely to stay. Missouri is not a coastal state. It doesn't have some attractiveness for people outside of the state to move there, like a Texas or Florida or California or New York or whatever that have different varying aspects. We have to rely on our homegrown talent to grow our economy and our population. And so it really makes a lot of sense for us to invest in the things that keep our people there. And that would be, in my mind, entrepreneurship, where all the net new jobs come from. And Victor was just so encouraging. We just hit it off, got along, and said, hey, and he's like, hey, let's kick around some of my policy ideas. And I was like, hey, what if we just did a Right to Start Act in Missouri?
That was a seminal moment, and Victor remembers that and brings it up every time I talk to him real briefly, because I remember getting on the phone with you, and we went through 12 to 15 ideas, and you just said, let's put them all into one bill and call it the Right to Start Act. So Travis, you deserve a lot of the credit. Now, over time, that was whittled down, because it's very hard to get everything done in one bill. Talk to us about kind of what the final bill looked like.
Yeah, well, the Office of Entrepreneurship, I think, is a big deal. And hopefully that office, which basically brought authority to the governor to decide what that looks like. But hopefully that office will coordinate with all the incubators, all the mentorship programs, all the investment organizations, the Missouri Technology Corporation, which invests millions of dollars into startups in our state over the last 20 years, which was started by Governor Matt Blunt back 20 years ago. But the Office of Entrepreneurship is a big deal, and then getting data on what kind of money startups are getting from our state in contracts. I think getting contracts as a startup from the state gives you instant credibility, and so that made a lot of sense as to figuring out, does our state even give startups contracts? Are we lending credibility to new companies in our state? And that feels like low-hanging fruit, where the state ought to be giving funds to the talent that we have in our state.
And you also had the regulatory sandbox.
Regulatory sandbox. That was another big piece of it, yeah.
Was not a right to. We obviously support those issues, but that came through another organization, and then you combined them, so it was a bigger right. It was a bigger entrepreneurship package, which I think a lot of legislators got behind, and it brought many people together.
Yeah, the regulatory sandbox kind of comes out of Utah. It does come out of Utah. They did a very focused regulatory sandbox years ago in tech and healthcare, or finance and healthcare, I believe. And we just saw that as this great program where we can remove some barriers for startups and try to give them, get the government a little bit out of the way if they have innovative products. And we got that passed. The governor was very supportive, and it basically allows all industries to make a case for why they shouldn't have regulatory frameworks in place that prevent them from doing their incredible work.
Later on, I want to talk to you kind of about the bipartisanship of this package and how you were able to convince people from all parties to come together. Next, I want to hand it over to Tom. Tom, tell us a little bit about the good news and bad news about what's happening at U.S. federal level on movement for entrepreneurship and small businesses regarding policy. Let's start there with you. I know that's a loaded, big question, but I feel like you can educate us better than anyone on those issues.
Well, yeah, I get to pretend that I'm an economist on the one hand and on the other hand. So first, let's start. I'm going to start and end with the good news, just to reflect the optimism that small business owners have. The first is the good news broadly. I mean, some of you saw some of the data earlier that SBA Administrator Isabel Guzman talked about. I mean, we're looking at the gold, silver, and bronze levels of startups in the United States. I mean, it's an unbelievable time to be an entrepreneur in the United States. That's good news. The bad news is that as much as politicians speak favorably about small business. And you showed some really good data about the overwhelming support of small business and the overwhelming desire to help. The bad news is that even with the desire to help, it's not always helpful. And I find myself repeating one of the things I've learned as a husband. I've learned as a husband that wanting to help and being helpful are two different things. And I find myself explaining that to really well-intended legislators. I'll give a couple of examples. The Paycheck Protection Program was really successful. When you look at the government's ability, Isabel Guzman, others' ability to just get money out as fast as possible. And that came from a crisis where government forced shutdown of many businesses, and we needed to get cash flowing into the economy. So it was born out of a place of desperation and love. But when that PPP loan set of requirements came out and government tried to micromanage how the small businesses would spend it, it almost got to the point of being more harmful than beneficial. I say almost because as many things bad as you could say about the programs, it still was really helpful. And I still meet small businesses every day that wouldn't have survived but for PPP. But I use it as an example because that desire to help was there for the whole COVID relief program. And sometimes we can't help ourselves but try to micromanage that. And that's the bad news, is that when politicians, policymakers try to micromanage a result, unfortunately, it has negative impacts for small business.
On that note, talk to us about the importance of not only the people in this room, but galvanizing other entrepreneurs around why it's important to have a seat at the table in DC and engage with someone like you and also meet with their U.S. Congress folks. When in an era where they believe that it's dysfunctional and there's gridlock, why is it important for entrepreneurs to get engaged in policy advocacy?
The reason it's important is for entrepreneurs, for all of you as stakeholders. Many of you are entrepreneurs yourselves. Many of you either are married to or live next to an entrepreneur. The reason for that involvement is authenticity. I get paid to lobby Congress every day. And I have the blessing of representing America's small business owners. We have 3 million businesses that belong to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. It's made up of mostly of members of state and local chambers of commerce. It's an unbelievable honor. But whenever one of those small business owners comes to Washington, D.C. and tells their story, that's worth 10 visits from me. So that's a rough estimate. It's probably more. But it's the authenticity of the stories that we tell and the communities that decisions impact that makes such a difference. So if you look at that in the opposite way of no involvement or relying on other people to do that involvement themselves, the actual system collapses. And that beloved sense of small business in this country that you pointed to in your graphs goes away. And none of us want to see that happen.
Well said. And I've seen studies around personal stories from the Congressional Budget Management Foundation and their advocacy trainings. And almost every staffer says that the personal message at the top of an email gets read before the others at a very high rate. So well said, Tom. Moving over to David Watkins. Everywhere I go in the country, talking to different states, they're like, can you connect us to what Indiana's doing around entrepreneurship? So the fact that I know David is very helpful. Tell us a little bit about what's going on in Indiana over the last 3 to 4 years, kind of some of the progress, and then we'll get further into kind of all the different things you're doing there in the office.
Well, that's great to hear. I appreciate the accolades from our colleagues, and certainly, echo my panelists. Appreciate getting to come to events like this and learn what other states are doing, and we actually, we'll bring these things back and see what we can do in Indiana. I would say our journey really started, like many states, with capital programs, and I think there was a difference in Indiana that about 3 to 4 years ago, we took capital programs out of a strictly finance function, and we started to think about it in the terms of an entrepreneur, right? So why do we have capital programs to assist entrepreneurs with accessing the funding that they need to grow? And then it kind of started to go from there, really. A lot of these functions that we do now in Indiana, many of them emanated out of the pandemic. Actually, I'm glad, Tom, you brought up the PPP program, because I distinctly remember sitting in my office with the one staff member I had at that time as the director of small business, and basically saying, like, where the heck could a small business go? And there's 537,000 small businesses in the state of Indiana. Where could a small business go to just find the resources from a couple well-known technical assistance programs like an MEP, a PTAC, and an SBDC? Like, where's the one website that has just those three? It didn't exist. And yet all of those resources were there and available for all of our entrepreneurs and small businesses to take advantage of. Fast forward to this year, we now have a team of 15 people that I oversee, and all day, every day, those folks are working on entrepreneurship and small business. We have a kind of $62 million a year departmental budget and a
stunning.
Yeah, and a $250 million investment fund. And so not all of that happened over the last 3 to 4 years, but I think the coalescing of this programming with something that Jonathan and the Gen team said earlier today, with the entrepreneur positioned as like the ultimate goal, the deliverable. Who are we here to serve? These programs are here for the entrepreneur, for the small business owner. With that goal in mind, there was a lot that we could accomplish to improve the access to these programs and the access to these services. We, by far, in a way, are not done. We're not settled. Don't feel like we're done yet. I tell my team all the time how access to a program cannot run through a person, right? Like I cannot stress that enough. There are, again, 500,000+ small businesses in the state of Indiana. If they have to meet with me or someone from my team to learn about an opportunity to accelerate, to grow their business, to receive technical assistance, to access funding, that's not scalable, right? Like I can't hire enough people to do that 500,000 times. So, keeping that focus on the system level of how do we serve entrepreneurs as a state, how do we encourage local communities, because even better than having a relationship with the state, if a local small business or entrepreneur can connect with their local chamber of commerce and their local economic development and their legislators and corporations in their local community, all the better, because those people are neighbors, and neighbors want to support neighbors being entrepreneurs. They want to invest in each other. It means something when a town or a city deploys a local loan fund to invest in an entrepreneur. You feel invested in by your neighbors. I'm not going to let them down. So even better when it happens at the local level. So we try to keep our purview at the state level really focused on where are those spaces where there should be some type of public intervention to fill a gap or to induce an activity that wouldn't happen on its own, or to de-risk an investment that might not otherwise come to fruition. And so, we've spent a lot of time on that in the last 3 to 4 years. It's been building for the better part of probably the last decade in Indiana. And now, what gets me out of bed in the morning is the opportunity to 3 or 4 or 5x that investment over the next 3 to 5 years.
How did that start, that investment? Because when you hear 60 million and 15 employees, I'm walking around or traveling the country just saying, can we get one person in the state, just one human that, when like the federal government, I'd love to have someone in the White House that, and this is something we'll advocate for in the administration, that I know is the head of entrepreneurship. I know I can go to that person, I can have them come to my community. How did it start there? Was it smaller when you started? Was it?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It was
a lot smaller.
So I've been doing this work for 6 years, and I joined a 3-person team. So okay. That gives you a sense. But interestingly, it was a 3-person team, but the budget wasn't all that different. And I think it actually comes from policymakers. Obviously, our legislature, as many states' legislatures are, is a part-time legislature. And many of those legislators are entrepreneurs and small business owners themselves. And that matters. And when you start to tell the story of what can we do for our local businesses compared to what we can do for global businesses, it actually seems pretty obvious when you say, well, geez, if we can do this for this big global business, surely we can do this smaller scale investment for small businesses. So, I mean, we feel great about the investment that the state is making in entrepreneurship and small business in Indiana. It still does not compare to the investment we're making in kind of the traditional fields of economic development around attraction, foreign direct investment, et cetera. And yet, what I truly believe is the next level storytelling is the ability to capture the data and the return such that I can prove on a apples to apples basis that creating 5 jobs at 100 companies is a better economic development policy than bringing in one company from outside the state to create 500 jobs over the course of the next 5 to 10 years, right? I truly do believe that those are the folks who are more likely to live in the state, to stay in the state, to be invested in the state. They're the folks that aren't going to go to another state because that's where they want to be and where they want to raise their families and where they want to call home. And so, to me, it's not necessarily a bad thing. We can walk and chew gum at the same time, but it's a missed opportunity.
Yeah.
It's like our economic growth could be here, but because we're stuck kind of with our old investment models, we're here. And I just, I'm not about untapped potential, so we want to go get it.
Victor Wong, our CEO, is speaking at the International Economic Developers Conference in September. So we continuously try to impact typical economic developers around the importance of these issues. So hopefully we'll galvanize a few at that as well to hopefully get them to care more about entrepreneurship. Travis, Senator Fitzwater, talk to us about how this bill became bipartisan in Missouri, because we've noticed that a lot of rural Republicans and urban Democrats really have both kind of teamed up on these types of issues, in Missouri especially.
Well, I mean, just look at your slides. I think across the board, entrepreneurship is a priority. Everybody knows one or is one or has some connection to one. Their neighbor is one. It's just really unites a large swath of Americans. I think our economy's built on it. Everybody knows that. Our history and the beauty of this country is based on the idea that you can start a business and succeed and pull yourself up by the bootstraps and give yourself an opportunity. It spans every socioeconomic position. Entrepreneurship just impacts so many levels in so many different ways. And so, this is something that when you talk to people, they don't see the partisanship that you get with the social issues or even fiscal issues or any other issues. It's like, well, I'm getting calls on a daily basis from business owners in my office. If you're a legislator, you're getting calls from business owners and you're whacking a mole every day on government inefficiency. And so you just try to kind of incrementally take away at some of those barriers to entry for the folks that you represent. And entrepreneurship issues just constantly. I mean, just the other day I had a constituent who's this really successful brewery developer out of one of my areas, and his paperwork didn't make it through the bureaucracy, and they sent a letter. He never received it, and so nobody knows whose fault is whose. But he's on July 4th having to shut down his brewery, which is probably maybe the best day of the year for them. And so we're calling the division of alcohol and trying to figure out how to not ruin this guy's business overnight because he didn't have the right paperwork. And you're doing that all the time. And I think when you experience that, it's not just my office that's having that issue. You're having St. Louis City has those same issues, the same burdens on entrepreneurs. The Kansas City rural areas have their own departments of economic development or they have their own regulatory environments that impact entrepreneurs. So I think it's just something that spans the spectrum of our population.
And you work with Democrats on amendments on that bill. Travis came up with the idea, instead of just requiring the state to dedicate 5% of their contracts to new and young companies, why don't we track it And so that was appealing. So you can actually know what the state is doing before you dive deeper. And that was able to get done. And then you added an amendment on there with the Democrat to track minority, women-owned, and veteran businesses as well as encourage more around those things.
Yeah, I think the more data you have, the better decisions that you can make, hopefully. And so with our Office of Administration that divvies out contracts in the state, hopefully having some information about whether they give out contracts to startups in the first place is going to be helpful for us to decide on policy going forward, instead of out the gate mandating OA needs to give out 5% of contracts. Maybe we're already doing that. I doubt we are. But in the event that we aren't, we at least have data to say, hey, we need to start lending credibility to our startups.
Tom, legal challenges are becoming a big deal with regards to policy these days, especially in DC with new policies coming out of the commissions and regulation or regulator rulemaking. What is going on with that, and what has success rate been for folks maybe challenging policies being made by executive action, I guess, rulemaking action, commission action?
Well, thank you for the question. I'm a lawyer by training, and so this is not what you would typically expect an attorney to say. Policy should not be made by filing lawsuits. That's just not the right way to do it. The right way to do it is what Travis has done. Get thoughtful people, small business owners. I gotta say, it's a little intimidating when there's a guy with a camera that's like
He's doing a great job.
But anyway, we'll get back on track here. Our success rate at the U.S. Chamber actually is something I'm very proud of, because we're running about an 84% victory rate of challenging federal regulatory overreach. But I need to preface that with the reality that even though I'm very proud of our legal team and the 24 amicus briefs that we filed in the Supreme Court and a number of injunctions that have prevented regulators from overreaching, going beyond their statutory authority and imposing new requirements on small businesses, even though I'm really proud of that rate, I insist that that's just not the way we're supposed, as a nation, we're supposed to be coming up and passing policies that are better for the entrepreneurial community. So it is a little bit of a function of hyperpartisanship. It is harder these days to do what you did, Senator. And so that is even a bigger feather in your cap for, even though it took a long time to start and then restart this law. On the one hand, these issues shouldn't be partisan. But on the other hand, they are. And when you're passing a law in a state or in Washington, D.C., at the end of the day, it's a partisan exercise. And the hyper-partisan divide makes it tougher for the President of the United States to get things done. I mean, the older I get, 4 years seems like 4 years just goes by too quickly. And so presidents now, when facing a hyper-partisan Congress, want to get things done. And when they want to get things done, they tend to kind of gloss over what they're allowed to do in an effort to cement their legacy. And unfortunately, that means going beyond what the law allows. So we have lawsuits against the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Environmental Protection Agency, Department of Labor, Federal Trade Commission, and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And I'll just kind of close with explaining that each of these actions is challenging something that came from a place of wanting to help. But I believe largely because the small business community was shut out of the process, the end decision was wrong. I'll use as an example the Department of Labor's regulation that penalizes independent contractors. I realized why the Department of Labor put this rule out following California's AB5 rule, and that is to try to prevent large corporations from just laying off a bunch of their workers and then rehiring them as independent contractors to get their benefits costs down. That's the intention of the rule. So it comes from a place of love and wanting to help. But what they didn't realize is that America is made up of independent contractors. Over 80% of America's small business, I mean, you all know this, are non-employers. So by trying to help, they're basically shafting over 80% of the entrepreneurial community in the United States. And when that happens, organizations like the U.S. Chamber have to step in and say, no, you've gone too far. The law does not allow for you to do that. Specifically, in this case, they prevented a law from passing to do this. That doesn't mean that you have the ability to just do it anyway, and we're going to take you to court. So it's an unfortunate consequence of overreach, and hopefully we can get past hyper-partisanship to developing policy the way it should be, and that is starting with our North Star, starting with asking communities of entrepreneurs, what do you think should be the solution, and building that into bipartisan solutions.
Wonderfully said. David, let's turn it back to you. You've talked about all the good things you've done already with your office. What do you want to move into and grow and expand in moving forward? And then the next question is, GEC 2025 will be in your state. When they announced it in Australia last year, it was quite the celebration. You had a huge contingent of Indiana folks there. Tell us a little about that and how that'll impact the state. But let's start with kind of moving forward into 2025. What other things do you want to focus on as an office around economic development and entrepreneurship?
Yeah, well, thank you, Jason. And certainly, Right to Start is on our radar. We think it in some ways we're recognizing a lot of the work that's been done by my team, by others who came before us. I think there's also, I mentioned we're never satisfied. Like the entrepreneurs and small businesses we try to serve, and I grew up in a small business. My family owned a small business for 93 years. We're a scrappy team. And so we have, gone out and we have taken advantage of opportunities, but there's a lot left to be codified. We've taken advantage of federal funds, we've taken advantage of state funds, we've taken advantage of sponsorship and fundraising and all sorts of things. But there's still an opportunity to codify how entrepreneurship and small business fits into economic development. And I would argue not only fits into economic development, but is good economic development, right? And so we're pursuing those opportunities. I think there's a tremendous opportunity to build off of some of the work that the Senator has done and others in Nevada and New Mexico and elsewhere with a renewed focus on the regulatory sandbox, a focus on what those permitting and licensing and other barriers that may stand in the way of an entrepreneur or small business growing. Some of them may be absolutely right and wonderful regulation. Some of them may just be a matter of guiding and connecting a resource to the right place to get the right answer at the right time. Because they just don't know how to navigate the state or the federal bureaucracy, as it were. And so I think there's a lot of still tremendous opportunities to continue to lean in, connecting our ecosystem more and more. We've undertaken some pretty significant efforts to not just invest in our capacity as a government to do this type of work, but to invest in the capacity of ESOs and co-working spaces and local governments to do this type of work. Some of the most impactful investments we have made have been to rural chambers of commerce and economic development groups that will never ever land a big mega deal or a big attraction. And in some instances, we're talking about investments like $40,000 so they can run, as far as they're aware, their first ever pitch competition for those local businesses. I mean, people were emotional at that type of investment from the state. And again, going back to what I said before, all the better then if that local community can be engaged in that process. But I think we continue to look forward to what is next, what is right, how should policy change over years?
I think that's important, is like looking at what policies are working and not, and then referring that back to the legislature.
And I'll give you an example. So, over a decade ago, we started, not unlike, I think, Missouri's Technology Corporation, we started a direct investment entity at a time when the venture capital ecosystem in Indiana was nascent, maybe I'd say nil, but it was very small. Let's just put it that way. It has now significantly grown. A lot of that just from the risk taking of our entrepreneurs and venture capitalists and others willing to make those investments in Indiana. Some of it because of the public policies that we've put in place to incentivize tax credits or fund support or matching programs, et cetera. But what policy served 10 years ago may not now be the right policy. We may 10 years ago have been in a situation where government support for that type of activity was de-risking and inducing private sector investment. Fast forward 10 years, now we need to assess whether that's still the case or whether government support has started to become anti-competitive. And so that's the other piece. These policies need to change over time. The needs of the businesses and the entrepreneurs change. The landscape of the macroeconomy changes, so our policymaking has to be adaptive as well. So all of these are things that we hope people will be interested in experiencing and learning about themselves and from colleagues all over the globe when Indiana hosts the Global Entrepreneurship Congress in 2025, June 2nd through 5th.
Mark your calendars.
Yeah, mark your calendars now. I believe, and my team will correct me after the fact if this isn't accurate, but we're going to be opening up registration in the next month or so. So be on the lookout for Global Entrepreneurship Congress 2025. But we're excited to, I think, showcase certainly the things that we've been doing in Indiana, the ecosystems that we've been building, the communities that are flourishing. But again, also bring all of these policymakers and decision makers from Missouri and from DC and from states that are thinking about how they can do more for entrepreneurship in the U.S. and from around the world. In many cases, it struck me in coming to these events and engaging with the Global Entrepreneurship Network that there are a lot of countries around the world that are really, in some ways, at a national level, more serious about entrepreneurship and small business than we are in the state. And I think that there's an opportunity for them to bring their passion and their belief in how entrepreneurs and small businesses can grow their national economies, bring it to Indiana, bring it to the United States, and show us that passion so that we start to really think in a bipartisan way about how at a national and at a state level and then at a local level we should be redirecting our efforts around entrepreneurship and small business.
Great, we're looking forward to that. They're going to put on a huge event there. Just very cool for the United States to have that coming back. I want to finalize this before we get to our Q&A. We're going to have time for a Q&A. Hopefully start thinking of some good questions for this great panel with another country story. Tom, you recently visited Africa, and there was a good startup idea that you learned about that started great and maybe didn't do what it intended to do. And I'd love for you to tell us that story because we hear about all these different types of ideas happening in other countries. What did you hear about what they're doing in Africa and what happened with that?
So I had never been to that continent before, and I had never experienced a new democracy before, so really an amazing experience. Also connected with my work with Jen, so it all comes back to Kansas City and Global Entrepreneurship Network and the stakeholders of all of you. When you asked about what's working and what's not working, so what's working in Tunisia. First of all, it's a beautiful, beautiful country. Their beaches, I'm not much of a beach guy, but their beaches are beautiful. The Mediterranean is beautiful. The food is delicious. Anyone here like spicy food? Like, whoo, yeah, it's, go to Tunisia. And the people and the entrepreneurs are some of the most well-educated people in the world. I mean, all of them are trilingual, French, Arabic, and English, and Tunisia invests a ton of money into educating the young men and women there. That's the good news. Bad news is they're suffering from brain drain because the European Union and United Arab Emirates can afford these young men and women who are highly educated. They just go. And so they're losing the asset that they have spent so much money, time, and resources in developing. And they know they've got to get that right. And so I was there at a time where they're really struggling with that. How do you attract their young men and women to stay or come back to Tunisia. That, and I realize more than ever, this ecosystem that we talk about, like we're all talking about the entrepreneurship ecosystem, but there's a bigger ecosystem, and that is the business ecosystem and the large and small businesses and the mutual dependency they have on each other. I'll add in government as well. We were talking about government contracts. In Tunisia, it's great to have the government contract, but you know up front you're not going to get paid for a year or a year and a half. Now, you'll get paid, but what small business can float 18 months of capital on a government contract? Certainly not a startup. Maybe a small business that's pretty well established and has cash reserves, but not a startup. That's one of just many examples of them trying to get this broader ecosystem and amplification result of getting a few stories out.
Can I jump in on this one just really quick? Because what I do outside the legislature is I have a small media company. I do contracting on this stuff. You have the world at your fingertips with a cell phone. I mean, just go video somebody telling their story. It takes 3 minutes, and it doesn't have to be great. Just produce something. Create the content. If you have an innovative story, if you have an inspiring story, record it on your phone and post it on your Facebook page. You don't know that it may get 30 views. It may get 10,000. It may get 1 million. You just never know. These things, it's hard to figure out the algorithms. You don't have to do that. Just take action. And it's really, it's on your organization to do that. You have stories. Everybody's got stories at their fingertips. It's just actually taking the action to create it and tell it to people. And the barrier to entry on that nowadays is as minimal as it's ever been, and it's only getting easier. So tell the stories.
Final question, ma'am?
gravitate into the entrepreneurial mindset that you want them to, and then there's challenges of the private sector because of this streamlining of all the various organizations. So you as a government, you will create the policy and create the program, but this entrepreneurs don't have to interface with trying to open a bank account, new bank account challenge. They have to do legal services, which is not under you, and to get them there to get all their policies, their requirements, and the time. How do you determine that your policy is working when you have to be challenged with all these steps?
And maybe I'll take a first stab. I mean, I think there is always a need to think about the economic and the financial return, right? And a need to calculate that and know it and be able to tell that story of the return, and maybe the qualitative side as well when it comes to working with legislators and other stakeholders as to the value of the programming. Certainly talking to the entrepreneurs directly. This data is a little stale at the moment, but as of middle of June, our team, through our various partnerships and programs in Indiana, had already assisted 7,000 entrepreneurs this year. And so that's 7,000 touch points with our prime customer who we're trying to assist. Listening and being able to take that learning and actually implement it. And by the way, the other thing I should say is, just because the return is hard to calculate or the horizon for the return is longer than an election cycle doesn't make the programming any less impactful. Probably one of the most impactful things we do in the state of Indiana is something that none of my team will ever see the end of. We run a high school and middle school pitch competition. Like, I expect that payoff in 30 years, right? Like when those kids now are starting a business or being entrepreneurial within a larger corporation. And so, we shouldn't shy away from those things that are hard to measure or are far out in the time horizon, but being able to talk about at least a conversation around what return we're expecting. We expect a higher rate of entrepreneurship because of this investment. When that rate of higher entrepreneurship comes, which we're not sure when it will come, we expect the state to see these kinds of economic benefits because we have more people who will consider entrepreneurship. And at the end of the day, there's a role for us to understand what is our lane and where we're most apt to fix or not fix, or attempt to fill gaps or not fill gaps. And it can get difficult. I mean, and we've certainly had programs that not everyone was on board with. You mentioned legal and banking. We've had a few programs in Indiana that are specific to mission-based early stage lending for diverse founders. And there's a lot of folks who think, well, traditional banks can do that just fine. And that's not what we're hearing from the entrepreneur. So I appreciate their willingness to be at the table and to talk to us about how we can best serve small businesses and from an access to capital point of view. But I'm talking to these entrepreneurs, and here are the challenges that they're saying they have accessing the banking system. And so, there's also a role that we can play connecting and facilitating conversations that need to happen.
Well, everybody, I'd like to give a round of applause with you all to our amazing panelists. Thank you all for coming to this today, and obviously they can answer any questions that you might have throughout the week or tonight. So enjoy the happy hour, and thank you for coming to this session today. Have a great day.